Hey, everybody. Mark and I have over 20 years of experience as therapists and as addicts in long-term successful recovery. We know better than anyone what works and what doesn't to break out of porn and sex addiction, heal betrayal trauma, and reclaim your relationship.
And we've poured all of our personal and professional recovery and healing experience into a first-of-its-kind program for addicts, spouses, and couples. We call it Dare to Connect.
At least 4 times every week, we engage with you in real time, in the trenches, giving you the knowledge and the tools to take back your life and relationship.
Whatever else you've done on your journey for healing and recovery, you've never done anything like this.
Mark and I, we've made all the mistakes, so you don't have to. Don't reinvent the wheel.
We all know tomorrow never comes. Look, don't wait one more day to change. Claim your free 2-week trial today at daretoconnectnow.com.
Hey, everybody. I'm Steve Moore.
And I'm Mark Castleman.
We know the pain and heartbreak of porn and sex addiction.
And we know the triumph of breaking completely free.
Every day, we help our clients find hope and healing.
Join us in the fight to take back your life, your marriage, and be stronger than ever.
This is the PBSE Squared podcast. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the PBSE podcast. Steve Moore and Mark Castleman here. It's great to be with you guys today. We're on episode 157 of the podcast. We hope that you're enjoying the new year and that the month of January is treating you well. We've got a good question that came in from a listener of ours. And it's actually kind of a unique situation because the listener, this is an addict who's writing in, but he is the partner of a spouse who actually came on and asked a question about a year ago. We covered her question back on episode 107. How can I ever dare to trust him again? And so we'd invite you to go back and listen to that. We have over 150 episodes here. We've been up and running for just over 3 years. This is our second week into our third year. So it's kind of neat because we're having a follow-up here from an addict, which is awesome. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this to you. He's got a fairly short piece here, and he's got a question that he has attached at the end. I am a recovering porn addict and the grateful husband of the listener whose question about foreboding joy you answered in episode 107. And then he continues on. If you have time, I would be grateful for your insights on the 2 questions below. I tried to provide context without becoming too long-winded. I really connect with everything in episode 149. Which was, a couple months back. As a porn sex addict in recovery, how do I let go of deep feelings of shame and unworthlessness? I am working hard on and making progress with my feelings of worthlessness in my therapy sessions and through fellowship in SAA, which for those who don't know is Sex Addicts Anonymous. I believe I can change. I believe that my wife deserves an improved, authentic, and integrated man. I am now grateful that I have a new life, but I am not sure that I feel like I deserve this new life. The last part of the listener's message really hits me hard. Quote, even if she forgives me, I'm not sure my self-worth would allow me to accept it, unquote. This is the situation I am in right now. And here come his questions. My wife forgave me after my 9th step amends to her last year. But how can I forgive myself for my betrayal of her before I have given her at least 18 years of my authentic, integrated, sober self? In our recent couples therapy session, our CSAT told my wife that, quote, and I won't use his name, but referencing him, I'll call him Joe. Joe is proud of his sobriety of 20 months, unquote. But I still struggle to feel proud. I feel happy, grateful, encouraged, and hopeful, but not proud. How can I feel proud that I have not now done the minimum basic expectation of being faithful for 20 months when I betrayed her for a whole 18 years? Any insight you can provide would be much appreciated. And then he goes on to describe, and I won't read this off for sake of time, but the long list of things that he's been doing for the past couple of years, everything from attending a couple of meetings a week to going through, and he's already completed the steps once. He's working on the 12 steps again, doing daily check-ins with his wife, They're working with a CSAT right now, and there's a whole list of other things that he is doing. So, it's just some great questions to jump into. But I think Mark and I, before we even jump in, would want to congratulate you and say, it's so good to hear that you're working such a thorough recovery program.
Yeah.
Really, really applaud that. Awesome.
Yeah. Going through his list was impressive.
Yeah.
Frankly, it's not often. I mean, we of course have clients that will work things at the level he's describing, but boy, he's got a thorough, comprehensive list. I don't know that there's anything that we would suggest he should be doing that's not on his list.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
It's pretty darned impressive. Yeah, we applaud him for all the hard work.
For sure.
Yeah, really good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a great question to ask. I don't know if we've answered one similar to this on the podcast, but this listener is identifying a really hard part of recovery for a lot of the guys that we work with. And I'm actually really passionate about this topic because this was a huge struggle for me. I've said before on the podcast that, I'm over 8 years sober. I've been in recovery for at least 11 years. I think I've been attending 12-step for about 12, but probably didn't get really serious for a little while. So I've been doing this for a while. And I remember once I got into recovery and then especially into sobriety, as we went through, for example, we just all went through the holidays here as a planet. And I remember that the holidays for me, like one would think, contrary to what one would think, where maybe the first year would be the hardest, it was actually, for me, it was years 2 and 3 around the holidays. And that was kind of reflective of a bigger reflection of years 2 and 3 in recovery. I was very much in a place that this gentleman is describing and about at the same time frame as well. I'd been working a lot of recovery. I had some sobriety under my belt, and I, in many ways, was now just coming to grips with really the full impact of how much damage I had actually done. I knew that all along, but for so many of us, as we're in the early stages of recovery, and we aren't good at self-awareness, we're not good at practicing authenticity, we're not good at emotional vulnerability or any of those things. Oftentimes, a lot of that flies under the radar, and as we really get involved in this process, and our hearts begin to open up, we begin to become transparent, not just with others but with ourselves. It can be very overwhelming to start to really see the full breadth of kind of the landscape of what has happened. And for us, my wife and I, this was a challenge. In fact, it became so much of a challenge that eventually my wife had to kind of, I killed a lot of flowers that during years 2 and 3, and came home literally in tears. Oftentimes from work, I'd hear a sappy song or something on my drive home, and that was about all it took to kind of put me in this place of, very close to shame. In some ways, it was maybe even shame-based, but just very much getting pulled back into these old feelings of guilt and letting go. And my wife got to the point where she eventually just had to say, kind of firmly, I have forgiven you and moved on. You need to be forgiving yourself. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is that idea.
Well, and this guy has something in place that is really a precursor to self-compassion and self-forgiveness. I'll tell you what didn't work for me in my early recovery, to have self-compassion and self-forgiveness. And that's when I was not fully immersed in recovery. So I was going through the motions. I was doing some good things in recovery, but I wasn't all in yet. And it took me a number of years to get to that place. And so if you're kind of working it, but not, you're half in, you're half out, and you're still, slipping or relapsing, you're going to find it impossible to navigate to this place that we're talking about today, which is self-compassion and self-forgiveness, because you have this other side that's still there. And you're going to be weighed down with duplicity and with, if you're hiding things, if you're still holding on to, old addiction habits because you're not quite ready to let them fully go, right? So the fact that this guy shows this really big, long, impressive list of so many things he's doing, he is in a place to then, to start to look at this shifting into self-compassion and self-forgiveness, because he's doing pretty much everything he can on his side.
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
sure he's not doing it perfectly. I'm sure that he still makes mistakes and messes up, but his willingness is really high.
Mm-hmm.
And his openness to doing whatever the programs and his therapist and 12-step ask of him, he really shows a great willingness to just do everything that's being asked of him.
Yes. Completely agree with that. I used to actually have this, I believe, hanging on my wall in my old office. I don't have it up there anymore, but a phrase that I kind of came up with a while, years and years ago, is the following. Guilt is healthy so far as it inspires change.
Yes.
And I continue to stand by that today, right? Guilt, that feeling of guilt, that icky feeling that we all get, that people refer to it as many different things, a conscience, the light of Christ. There's a lot of things that we could term it. Essentially, it's those feelings that we feel when, if I put it in a clinical sense, right, we do something that goes against our own moral value set or our own moral construct. It's the brain's way of saying, hey, the action we just took, or these actions that we're taking, they cross our boundaries, right? They cross our boundaries of the standard that we hold ourselves to, and what's okay and what's not. And those are, I would argue, those are great God-given feelings if you're a God-fearing person, because they do help to keep us on course in terms of our own authenticity, staying the track in terms of who we are wanting to become, what our vision for ourselves is, our authentic self. But um, the key to there, right, is it is healthy as far as it inspires change, right? As long as we are in a place where we are actively moving forward, where those feelings are pushing us and inspiring us to be something different, they're healthy, they're effective, they are a huge component to change. However, any effort expended beyond that, and we're going to get into the reasons why this can happen for a person, including for our listener here. Any effort expended beyond that in that guilt department, now we're crossing into either unhealthy guilt or definitely the realm of shame. It's kind of evil cousin. And we look to guilt, to help us to, we want to look into the future, right? There's a great quote by George Orwell. He says, we look to the past to help guide us in the future. And he who controls the past commands the future. He who commands the future conquers the past. And
Yeah.
so as we master and conquer our past, and we take the lessons that need to be learned from that, that is how we begin to command the future. But I think what is implied in there is that, and where many of us fall at risk, especially us addicts who are definitely shame prone and struggle with self-confidence and self-worth and self-esteem issues, and also trust issues, and we're going to get into that as well, is we sometimes get stuck just looking back, right?
Yeah.
Unable to look
Well,
forward.
and the place where this becomes toxic is when we get into this space when we look at the past and all the really destructive decisions we made, the pain we caused, our partner, spouse, and others. We can easily get into the place where that becomes an identity. That's who I was, and that's who I am. Right?
Yes.
A cold, unfeeling, selfish, loser and pervert, and all of these self identities that we get into, and that's when the toxic guilt and the shame really come into the picture. And what we want to do instead is to separate those past behaviors from our current identity.
Yes.
They're not the same thing. I know you do this too, Steve. I talk with my clients about this concept of top-down management in this process versus bottom-up. And what we mean by top-down management is this toxic guilt and shame really comes from your head, your brain, right? It's that part of us that is so accustomed to the negative self-talk and self-dialogue, and there's lots of religious constructs that get thrown in there and cultural things, and we get into this place of toxic guilt and shame, all to do with thinking errors. right? This whole all of the different thinking errors and character defects that we have. If you want to come at this from a healthy place, instead of being from the brain down, top down management, you want to now come at this from the place of your heart. And I often share how when I made that transition from this toxic guilt and shame and terrible inner dialogue happening in my head, and instead, when I felt regret about the past, I let it settle into my heart. I just kind of felt a deep sadness in my heart. In fact, I would take my hand and put it on my heart so that I could experience that sense of sadness in my heart, separate from all the thinking errors in my head. I like to refer to this in my faith tradition as a godly sorrow. I'm feeling a godly sorrow. And what does a godly sorrow do? It helps me own my choices of the past, but it's highly motivational for me to be a different man in this moment.
Yeah.
I let that deep sense of sadness motivate me to do different today. And so that's bottom up management, right? That's that heart, that spiritual connection, that my identity is, I'm a good man, I'm a son of God, whatever that identity is, you allow that to lead out. It doesn't mean you don't own the past, but you see it through a lens of I learned and I'm learning from that, and it's making me a different man today.
Yeah.
Yep.
I love that. That's a great thought. And if we kind of add a clinical spin to this a little bit, right, in terms of what is going on here oftentimes for a person, one of the topics that we cover oftentimes in our Dare to Connect program, which many of you have probably heard about, it's for addicts, spouses, and couples, meets 3 times a week during the week. There's an hour-long session for each of those demographics, as well as support groups for both addicts and partners on the weekend. We would love for you guys to come and join that. If you love the podcast, if you love what you're hearing here, take it to the next level. Take your recovery to an awesome place. Come grab the 2-week free trial that we have on Dare to Connect right now. We are looking at the price on Dare to Connect will be going up here in the next couple of months, and we would love to have all of you come and lock in the price at its current rate. It's a great way to start off the new year, and you can find more information about both the trial as well as the program at daretoconnectnow.com. But as I was saying, we do cover a lot of different topics, and one that we cover frequently is this concept and idea of thinking errors. How do they operate, right? How do they play a role in our lives? Thinking errors, as we often say, is a lens, quote unquote, through which we see the world. Everybody has these. They operate in the back of our mind. They develop from experiences that we've had from the past. They come from the culture that we're raised in and the family of origin that we come from, and they're lenses through which we see the world. And one of those quote unquote thinking errors that we oftentimes operate from that causes us to see things in a skewed perspective is what is referred to as the fallacy of fairness, right? It's this idea that life should be happening in a balance at all times, right? And that when there is an injustice in one area, there needs to be something compensatory, in another area, right? That is of equal value so that this equilibrium is maintained all the time. And even though that is a great concept, right, in the hypothetical world, there are a couple of things that really get in the way of this being a true concept, okay? The first is that fairness. Go ahead.
And I was going to say, Steve, this listener, when he wrote into us, he expressed a classic expression of this fallacy of fairness. What did he say?
I got to do 18 good years because I've given 18 bad ones. Right.
Until I've given her 18 faithful, connected years, I don't have a leg to stand on.
Yes, absolutely. Right. And so there is a lot to, and there's a lot of things that are even though, again, the notion makes sense on paper, when it comes to actual reality as it stands, there's a couple of things we need to do to correct that. Right. The first is that this idea of fairness is a subjective concept. Right. Everybody, rule number 1 for therapy, we talk about this often on the podcast, is that there are always 3 realities when it comes to a coupleship. Your reality, their reality, meaning your partner's reality, and then actual reality, right, as it stands. And those in some ways will line up, but in many ways they will also be in a constant state of disagreement because we all see and interpret the world around us differently from minute to minute. And so this idea of what is fair and what is not is constantly shifting and changing for a person depending on the subject, the instance, et cetera. The second piece to keep in mind with that is that we all experience reality differently, right? And we all experience relationships differently. Everybody brings pros and cons to the table. Trying to quantify a relationship as being quote unquote fair is unrealistic because of that in just a whole variety of ways, right? For
Mhm.
example, let's say Steve has 5 good traits. I'm Steve, right? Let's say I've got 5 good traits that I bring to the marriage. For my wife, what I consider those to be good traits in terms of their value, my wife is probably going to look at each of those and she'll value them slightly more or slightly less than I do, right? So you can already see how just over one simple observation, how the math is already off, and then it just branches off from there. It goes back to, again, this question of reality, right? There's so much subjectiveness to it. And so this fair piece just isn't realistic. So rather than asking this question, is it fair for me to stay in this relationship? Or more importantly, for this listener, and this is where I was at, in year 3 of sobriety, is it fair for her to stay in this relationship? What we need to be switching to is rather than asking that and trying to evaluate our partner's reality and say, is this fair? Is this not? What we need to be switching to, is it authentic, not fair, but is it authentic for me to continue to engage in this relationship, right? What is my reality and what is my truth? And how can I practice trust and letting go and surrendering and recognizing that my wife's truth should be just that, right? That's her truth. Does she want to choose, right? Is it authentic for her to keep staying in this relationship? So it's an important piece to recognize as we kind of go through this.
Well, and that was very much the case for me. It got to the place where, like this listener said, my wife had forgiven me. She was engaged in moving forward. Yes, the past was still painful and it would come up for her from time to time, and she would authentically express it. But she was very much consciously living in the now, in this present moment, and going forward. And she really didn't dwell on the past that much. Who do you suppose was the one in the relationship that dwelt on the past continually? It was me.
Yeah.
I was very much stuck in the past. And I brought it up a lot more than she did. And she was like you said, Steve, with your wife, she finally got to the place where she almost kind of had to, well, not almost, she set a healthy boundary. She said, I am not comfortable with you continuing to bring up the past and beat yourself up and self-flog and do all this stuff. She
Yeah.
said, I'm ready to move on. What do you need to do in order for you to be ready to move on?
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds like an odd question, doesn't it, for a betrayed spouse to ask their addict partner, what do you need to do to be ready to move on?
Mm.
Right? But it's very true.
Yeah. No, it absolutely is. And what we're really talking about here, guys, is a new level of vulnerability, right? And transparency. In any relationship, it is human nature oftentimes to quote unquote, we like to be in control. And without realizing it, it's very common for us to quote unquote decide, what makes sense for others using our own paradigm and our own lens, right? Our own experience. I mean, I've said oftentimes, to speak to this exact thing, I wouldn't want to be married to me. I don't know why you want to be married to me, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
And the reality is what does that stem back to? It stems back to one, letting go of control, but it also stems to trust issues. Choosing to trust that my partner is an intelligent, independent, smart, bright, confident person, and that they have the ability to make those decisions for themselves, and that they have the God-given right to choose me or to not. And it's scary to let go of that control for us. Oftentimes we will, for example, try to outwit rejection by saying sometimes that's an issue for us, right? We are so convinced that our spouse would never accept us. We almost try to move to a place where we self-sabotage and create a
Yep.
scenario where they can't accept us,
Yep,
right?
exactly.
Because we want to get ahead of the pain. The scariest thing in the world is to look at your partner, especially after we've caused this damage, and be able to say, here I am. I've done this work. I'm doing my very best. Do you still want to be with me? That's really scary. That
Mm-hmm.
there's a human component about letting go of that is scary for anyone, especially those of us who struggle with these self-worth and self-esteem issues, right? And so there is that leap of faith that we have to take, where we have to recognize, again, this person is smart, they're bright, they're intelligent. I need to let them, if they want to be in this relationship, I need to be my most authentic, transparent self. I need to live my truth. I need to give them all the information, right? Be open in my check-ins, sharing myself with them, the good and the bad. And then I do the hardest thing in the world, which is to step back and let them decide.
Let them decide. Yep.
What do they want?
Yep. And there was as we start to talk about this being authentic and letting our partner, decide what they choose and what they don't, it was obvious in my marriage that my wife was still choosing. And this was one of the hardest, this may be the hardest thing that I learned to do, and I still work on it with regard to our relationship. And that is, Steve, what you and I talk about, which is coming together as a coupleship, standing side by side to face a common enemy. Yeah. Now, here's where the difficulty and irony comes in. When that quote common enemy was the past addict Mark, right? All of my terrible, destructive, horrible choices and behaviors over decades. That was the common enemy. And when my wife would bring up some pain that something triggered, I actually found that I got better and better by getting in tune with my heart, that godly sorrow. I could more and more sit by her side and literally cry with her as the two of us looked at what I had done.
Yeah.
I was actually able to sit next to her and literally have empathy and weep with her about that common enemy. I could not do that from a place of shame. No way.
Absolutely. It's a great example. So much power in these concepts, guys. And we so appreciate this listener for writing in about this. I mean, we could go on and on about this topic. This is one of our longer podcasts than we've had in a while.
I know.
And as always, there's never enough time to cover all this stuff here, which again, please, if you are liking the Dare to Connect program, or you're liking the podcast, please come check out the Dare to Connect program, guys. We're bringing you something close to 20 hours of content a month and support for the cost of each of you having one therapy session a month. In this case right now, less, although the price is going to go up a bit, but still it's going to be under that price point. We would love to have you join us. You can find more information about that again at daretoconnectnow.com. Come lock in the current price point. We'd love to have you join and be with us. If you do have questions that you would like briefly tackled on the podcast, as always, like this listener, which we're very grateful to them for writing in, you can reach us at our podcast website at pbsepodcast.com. There's a contact form at the bottom where you can submit questions, and we can get you good, albeit brief answers. But we sure do love and appreciate our listeners. Thank all of you for your patronage, for tuning in as we roll into year 3 of this podcast in over 165 countries and 400,000 downloads and climbing. We just appreciate and are so grateful for each of you and from hearing from you, and for hopefully the positive benefit that you take away from this each week. And with that, we hope that you guys have a great week, and we will see you next time. Everything expressed on the PBSE podcast are the opinions of the hosts and the participants, and is for informational and educational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered mental health therapy or as a substitute thereof. It is strongly recommended that you seek out the clinical guidance of an individual qualified mental health professional. If you're experiencing thoughts of suicide, self-harm, or a desire to harm others, please dial 911 or go to your nearest emergency room.